Well, good morning, students. If you remember from our last lecture, we talked about zoos and how they are beneficial for society. We talked about how zoos benefit society in terms of economics, in terms of education, in terms of helping animals who are endangered to become more populated. But today we're going to talk about zoos in a little bit different light, in whether they are good or, not so much if they're good or bad for society, but are they good or bad for animals? And maybe you remember something from this movie. Of course, this is a clip from the movie Jurassic Park, where they thought it would be a great idea to build a zoo for dinosaurs. Well, of course, it would be fun for the people at first to go and see the dinosaurs, but later we learned that really the dinosaurs didn't really like to be in the zoo, and that's why, well, the Tyrannosaurus Rex and some of his friends started to attack the people who went to the zoo. Well, today we're going to talk about, not so much about the dinosaurs in the zoo, but we'll talk about what it's like for the animals who are in the zoo and how zoos really are not beneficial to them, and really how they don't seem to benefit society very much. Let's talk a little bit again about some of the history of the zoo. Zoo, of course, is short for zoological garden or zoological park, as sometimes you'll hear it. Sometimes zoos are referred to as a menagerie, meaning a wide variety of things or people or animals. You'll remember from the last lecture that the early zoos were pretty much just for the famous rulers or the very wealthy people around the world, such as in China, Egypt, Persia, and the Mayans even had those zoos. Although today our zoos are more similar to the zoos that we started to see in Europe about 200 years ago. The second picture there is a picture from the London Zoo in the 1800s. That zoo had exotic animals like camels, which were very unusual for the people in Europe to see. Modern day zoos, or as we say modern, might show animals in cages or enclosures like you see the elephant. And again, this gave people a rare opportunity to see animals that they wouldn't ordinarily see in their own communities. Zoos today are much better than the zoos from 200 years ago in terms of the space. The one photograph of giraffes there, you see that the giraffes do have more space to move around, that some of these nature parks do give zoos more opportunity, give animals more opportunity to move around. There we see a polar bear from the Cincinnati Zoo, and although Cincinnati can get very, very cold in the winter, it's nothing close to the climate that a polar bear would have up in the Arctic. Also, the amount of space that they give the polar bears is much, much smaller than the space that a polar bear would need in the wild. And so the Audubon Society, which is a supporter of birds and nature, does admit that zoos are better than before, but the reality is that zoos today are not good for the animals. And today we're going to talk about why we should close zoos, because they are far too restrictive or limited in the amount of space they provide the animals. Animals in zoos cannot go back out into the wild after they grow up in a zoo. We'll talk about research that says that zoos really are not especially educational for children, and some of the research done on animals in zoos is quite cruel and unfair to the animals. First of all, we're going to talk about how zoos are too restrictive for animals. And this is research done from the University of Bristol out of the United Kingdom. And they looked at elephants. And elephants typically roam or move about 40 kilometers a day, every day, as a family, taking care of their loved ones and supporting each other. However, in zoos, even when they are put in somewhat larger spaces than in the past, they're not in cages as they used to be, and the animals might seem happy to get a peanut or to get a banana from someone in the crowd, the reality is that this life is not good for elephants. Experts believe that life in a zoo can cause severe psychological problems to elephants, much like a person who might be confined to a small room or a jail by himself. These animals simply need more space and aren't given the opportunity to have it. This is also true in the aquariums, where you might see a famous whale or dolphin show. This is pictures from SeaWorld in Orlando, where you might see an orca. On a typical day, an orca whale might swim more than 100 miles or 160 kilometers. And that's nowhere close to the amount of space that a whale would need to move around. And research from the National Geographic also points out that in captivity or in an animal park like this, a whale might only live for 9 years compared to almost 50 years if they're out in the wild. And one other note about the whales, the orca is sometimes called a killer whale. Well, the reality is in the wild, it's not a killer animal. It doesn't kill people. However, the only known times that an orca or killer whale has actually killed was when it was confined to an aquarium, and that it became psychologically, there were psychological problems, and the whale ended up being a killer whale only because it was being treated very poorly. Another thing to consider as to why we should close the zoos, it comes from PETA. PETA stands for the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, a very important organization that fights for animal rights. One of the points that PETA makes is that animals raised in captivity or in a zoo cannot go back out into the wild. They simply do not have the skills to survive, as do monkeys or chimpanzees here, as you see, they do in the wild. On the right side, you see a monkey, and her name is Edith. And Edith is obviously getting very old. Edith grew up in captivity, and Edith could not survive out in the wild. So unfortunately, Edith has been shipped around to different zoos around the country, and Edith finally died a few years ago at a roadside zoo in Texas looking like this. And certainly no animal, whether it's a chimpanzee or a monkey, should have to have an existence in a zoo quite like that. This was the most interesting or shocking thing to me as I researched this topic, is that zoos are not really educational. And this comes from research from the Journal of Conservation Biology. They did a survey in the United Kingdom of 2,800 children. And they found that only 38% of the children who participated in a program at a zoo actually had a positive learning outcome. That means only 38% of the kids actually learned something correctly. The other 62% actually had no understanding or actually a negative outcome of what they were supposed to learn. And so the reality is that by bringing kids to zoos, oh, they might have fun looking at the cute and the funny animals. But the reality is they are not really actually learning the types of things that you might expect the children to learn inside the zoo. Another reason we should close zoos is that zoo animals simply do not live as long as wild animals. Earlier I talked about the whales. The orcas only live about 9 years in captivity compared to about 50 years out in the wild. In fact, down in Miami recently, one female who gave birth in captivity lost all 4 of her babies, likely because she was confined to too small of a space for a healthy mother to have babies. And of course, African elephants is another good example of how animals in captivity do not live very long. African elephants live 3 times longer in the wild compared to elephants in a zoo. And this is a result of constant exercise, proper eating, and psychological benefits of not being confined to a zoo or inside an enclosed area. And the final point I want to bring out is that much of the research that we do on animals is just plain cruel. There was a report recently on CNN that went to the Detroit Zoo, and they looked at 2 gorillas who happened to be brothers. These 2 gorillas were extremely aggressive and more violent than ordinary gorillas. And they were testing these animals to see what was the cause of a gorilla to become angry or violent. Well, they said there might be 3 reasons. These 2 gorillas are brothers. There was no female for them, and this may have been making them go crazy, so to speak. Also, their diet was very different than what gorillas would eat in the wild. And the other point was that these 2 were given food that is not consistent with what they might eat out in the wild. So as they were testing these animals in Detroit, it seemed very, very cruel as to why the animals were going crazy and becoming aggressive. It was because simply they were not being provided with a normal or natural life that a gorilla should have out in the wild. So finally, we've talked about some of the reasons why we should consider closing the zoos. Although I have to admit, I've enjoyed the time when I've gone to the zoos to have fun, to see different animals. The reality is that zoos might be fun for society, but they certainly are not fun or fair for the animals who are kept there. If you want more information to learn about the zoos, you can go to PETA.org or go to an organization called Captive Animals, which has a website at captiveanimals.org. Thanks for listening. I hope you have a great day.